me today. How's everyone? Good? So today's sermon is basically a continuation of Nehemiah. And Nehemiah chapter 5. Do we want to cut the lights a bit? And the title of the sermon that I was given was basically Sin Amongst God's People, which is always a bit of a challenging topic, and it's been a bit of a journey to get here this morning. Lots of strange technical issues last night and actually this morning, but we've got a bit of a presentation up for this. So one of the things that's quite a challenge with this kind of chapter is what's taking place is actually taking place in a much bigger and wider context. And we can look at specifically what's going on in this chapter, and we will, but we have to also look at that within the broader context. And so with a lot of the Word of God, there is several threads going on. So I thought perhaps just to lay some foundations, let's do a quick review and establish some context in terms of where we're at. So the first thing I think we covered previously was when we look at Nehemiah, we can't actually read it in isolation of the book of Ezra. And in fact, I think the two are kind of written sequentially together as one book in the Jewish writings. And obviously the topic around Nehemiah has been the rebuilding of the wall around the temple, or Jerusalem. But when we look at this, throughout this period, there's actually these five central themes, which started out in Ezra. The first focal point was really rebuilding the temple as the Jews began to return from exile. And as part of then rebuilding their temple and establishing it, it was the beginning of reconstituting the Jewish people and nation as a people, as a community. But that wasn't the end of it, and so we really in this sort of period of time move into then the start of Nehemiah, which is now the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. And what we now start to see as those walls are built and completed, focus in the coming weeks will now start to shift to really consolidating the Jewish community back to this area of geography, if you like. And essentially, and this I believe is God's whole purpose in the exercise, is the fifth point there, and that is consolidating them spiritually as a covenant community, as he intended, and as he established under the Mosaic covenant and associated laws. So essentially, as part of establishing the temple, rebuilding the walls, God was actually establishing the physical building blocks to actually rebuild his people. And rebuilding his people around the worship of him and devotion to him as a God-centered community. If we hop to the next slide. In a nutshell, it's also worth just bearing in mind as we go through this passage that these guys were still living in and under and part of the Persian Empire. And if we look at the chronology of the Ezra and Nehemiah timeline, overall it takes place over 100 years in time. And in fact, this particular event is sort of between 90 and 100 years into this period and this process. So it's a long time. Will asked a question earlier today, and that was, how old was Nehemiah? And I'm not terribly sure, but he must have been born in exile, given this was at about 97 years into the whole thing. In terms of next slide, a few other things that I think we should bear in mind. As I mentioned earlier, there are a number of threads going on throughout this timeline. One very important one is this whole concept of godly leadership, and this is something we see in Nehemiah as an individual. There's several aspects to that, but probably the most important ones are, first of all, God was right at his center. Everything he did out of a place of prayer, place of fasting, seeking God. And we see that all throughout the book. Another thing that we see in him as a leader, and he didn't choose leadership, it just was an extension of, I guess, who he was. And that was, he was compassionate and servant-hearted in his actions. So he wasn't just focused on pursuing his vision, his calling, to the detriment and exclusion of the team and the people under him and around him. Everything he did was done from a compassionate and servant-hearted, and we'll cover a bit of that off further on. And probably the other big point that we see in him, and Bridget dealt with this last week, was at all times he was godly in the face of opposition. Right? He always went to God before reacting or responding. Another thing that's a big theme all throughout, which I touched on earlier, was this was not just a physical rebuild of a temple, a city, and the walls, but it was also a rebuilding of the people and the community around true worship of God. And I think the thing that has really come through for me, and throughout this week in so many ways and unusual ways, as I've sort of really asked God, what is this all about, is this word community. God's community comes through continually, and more than just community, but living community God's way. Came up in the men's group on Friday morning, and believe it or not, even watching a bit of TV last night. And then the last sort of part of review and context is, I think we need to also bear in mind a little bit about Nehemiah himself as we read this passage, because I think there's some really interesting things about this. First of all, the meaning of Nehemiah's name is Yahweh has comforted, or the comfort of the Lord. And this goes back to the comment that I made earlier about, he was compassionate and servant-hearted. And we see this part of his character, his identity, if you like, coming through in how he responds to opposition. Another, I think, important thing to also bear in mind about him is that this guy played many different roles in his life, and I think we all can identify with that. And first up, he was a man of God. So he was devoted to God, he worshipped God, he followed the Lord in all that he did. At the same time, we have to also acknowledge and bear in mind that he was a high-ranking official in the Persian Empire. So in spite of being Jewish, he was also working for the enemy, working in the world. His first sort of big role that we're aware of is he was a cupbearer, which was a very important role in those times. But in the context of Nehemiah and the last week's chapter and the rebuilding of the wall, he was appointed governor of this area. So he had a very, very senior role within the empire. And that's quite important as we start to get into this passage. Other things that emerge also is he was a project manager building the walls of Jerusalem. And I think he's the kind of project manager I wish I had right now. How long did it take to rebuild the walls? Anyone know? 52 days. Which is astounding. Will, you had some figures this morning. So it's huge. It's huge. So yeah, he didn't have council to deal with and a consenting process or a building code, but 52 days. I wish I had him on my renovations at the moment. And of course, the last thing to note is he became very much a community leader amongst the Jewish people. So let's have a look at the passage. Nehemiah 5, 1 to 19, if you want to follow. Now the men and the wives raised a great outcry against their fellow Jews. Some were saying, "We are the sons and daughters are numerous in order for us to, when our sons and daughters are numerous, in order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain." Others were saying, "We are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during the famine." And still others were saying, "We've had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and our vineyards. Although we are of the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews, and though our children are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others." When I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. I pondered them in my mind and then accused the nobles and the officials. I told them, "You are charging your own people interest." So I called together a large meeting to deal with them and said, "As far as possible, we have bought back our fellow Jews who were sold to the Gentiles. Now you are selling your own people, only for them to be sold back to us." They kept quiet because they could find nothing to say. So I continued, What you are doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies? I and my brothers and my men are also lending the people money and grain. but let us stop charging interest. Give back to them immediately their fields, vineyards, olive groves, and houses, and also the interest you are charging them. 1% of the money, grain, new wine, and olive oil. We will give it back, they said, and we will not demand anything more from them. We will do as you say. Then I summoned the priests, and I made the nobles and the officials take an oath to do what they had promised. Quite smart, actually. I also shook out the folds of my robe and said, in this way may God shake out of their house and possessions anyone who does not keep this promise. So may such a person be shaken out and emptied. At this, the whole assembly said amen and praised the Lord, and the people did as they had promised. Moreover, from the 20th year of King whatever, Artaxerxes, when I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah until his 32nd year, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the food allotted to the governor. But the earlier governors, those preceding me, placed a heavy burden on the people and took 40 shekels of silver from them in addition to food and wine. Their assistants also lorded it over the people. But out of reverence for God, I did not act like that. Instead, I devoted myself to the work on this wall. All of my men were assembled, therefore the work, and we did not acquire any land. Make a note of that. We did not acquire any land. Furthermore, 150 Jews and officials ate at my table, as well as those who came to us from the surrounding nations. Each day, 1 ox, 6 choice sheep, and some poultry were prepared for me, and every 10 days an abundant supply of wine of all kinds. And in spite of all of this, I never demanded the food allotted to the governor, because the demands were heavy on these people. Remember me with favor, my God, for all I have done for these people. So Nehemiah 5 marks quite an interesting shift in focus. Last week, we saw how the community was facing external opposition. And what we now see is the emergence of internal opposition and associated issues with that Nehemiah needs to actually deal with. And what was starting to trigger this was really in the context of what was going on, the economic crisis, the famine, and what have you. The people were also rebuilding the wall with Nehemiah on the project. And so eventually they start to crack under the strain, and there's an outcry. And the interesting thing about the word outcry here is it's exactly the same Hebrew word that was used for the Israelites when with their outcry under their Egyptian oppression. It's exactly the same word. And so what was really the problem here? The problem was that their fellow Jews in the community, the guys that were well off and wealthy, were taking advantage of the economic crisis that was going on at the time. I mentioned, take note of that statement Nehemiah made of, we did not buy land. What was going on was when people got into trouble, they were mortgaging their lands, they were selling their lands to raise money in order to pay these exorbitant taxes to the Persian state. And they were being oppressed and exploited at that level. But some of the wealthier members of the community were taking this as a huge opportunity to acquire and amass further wealth and a further land. And we'll get to the significance of that in a minute. So that's kind of like somebody in our community who suddenly hit hard times, is struggling and ends up in a mortgagee sale. Should we go and take advantage of that situation and get a cheap property or piece of land at their expense? Just throw that one out there as an example of what was going on here. It's quite clear that this had been probably taking place over a lot longer than when Nehemiah actually arrived on the scene. Because as I said earlier, this is at nearly 100 years in to the period. Another thing that's quite interesting to note is in chapter 4, this entire community sort of came together and were working together in defending the work that they were doing against the enemy. And yet, within this community that was united to the external threat, there was this exploitation going on internally amongst each other. And it's just interesting how one crisis was piling onto the next. There was this oppression from the state, huge taxes, community taking advantage, and then on top of all of this, a famine was hitting them. And what we see in here is, this is not just a few people that were actually getting impacted here. Sometimes when we look and talk about oppression and injustice, we think about the poor and we think about poverty. But in here, what we see is several things. For example, in verse 2, people without land were short of food. Verse 3, landowners were forced to mortgage their properties to raise money. A lot of the community were forced to raise money or borrow money in order to meet their tax obligations. And in very extreme cases, some were having to sell their children into slavery. So, what is interesting as well is how grave this situation was, because this wasn't just the men of the community raising an issue at a community meeting. We see in there that actually their wives joined the protest, which was quite unusual under the way Jewish community worked. And we're really making a protest and basically going, we can't feed our families. Another interesting thing about this is their complaint and their protest was not against the Persian Empire. They were being exploited, they were paying huge taxes. Their actual focus and complaint was actually on what was happening amongst themselves. which I thought was just a really interesting thought. So the real question is, where was the sin? Which is really the topic of today. And the sin here was basically the community, the people who came from a Jewish background and what have you, were disobeying Mosaic law, which in part was designed to avert this sort of thing from taking place, from exploitation from taking place. They'd actually departed from God's principles in how we should live in community. And I think this is something we've got to, quite often when we talk about Mosaic law and the law and what have you, we think about a bunch of rules and regulations and what have you. But quite clearly in this aspect of it, I think there's some really important principles here that they had neglected. And the question I found myself asking as I studied this was, were these guys deliberately sinning? I pose possibly not. And the reason I say that is, as I mentioned earlier, this had been sort of unfolding over a period of nearly 100 years. A lot of these guys had been born into exile. A lot of them grew up and were part of Persian culture and would have adopted the ways of society. A lot of them would have been business people. We see property owners like ourselves. And a lot of them would have been just normal. There's an opportunity to acquire somebody's property. They can't afford it, so they're selling it, and I can afford it, and I'll buy it. Or somebody wants a loan, here's a loan, and I'm going to charge you interest. This was part and parcel of the society of the day, the culture that they had been born into and had grown up under. And I think that is something that we should be reflecting on here. To what extent are there things in our culture, in our society, in our community, and how we've grown up in this world that we just take for granted as normal, but in the eyes of God and the way we live and the way we operate and do things is actually sinful without actually knowing it? Just I guess, a question. So, and we do see that, if we go back in time in the Old Testament and what have you, that this whole area of oppression and exploitation, some would call it injustice, was a really big thing throughout Jewish history. And as that became prevalent in the community and in society, it was really a reflection of them starting to forget and become insensitive to God's laws. And we do see in Scripture that quite often that exploitation was very much one of the triggers or causes for people to go into exile. And I don't have time to develop that this morning, but we see it in Isaiah, Micah, Amos, and what have you, that the way they operated and behaved amongst the community could lead them into exile. And so under Mosaic law, God's covenant with the community, which in today's term I guess we call a theocracy. In other words, God at the center of that community, that nation, led by a priesthood, and the entire community functioning and operating around God at the center. We see in that, under that, whilst the individual to God is important, the individual is expected to act within the context that benefits the whole community. So the community as a whole is where God's heart is at, not just at the individual level. And if individuals in the community are suffering, the whole community starts to suffer, and society starts to suffer. And I think that's pretty close to home to what we see in our own world today. And so, the whole thing under Mosaic law was that any kind of business transaction was not purely there in the context of day-to-day physical operating, but it had a spiritual dimension to it. And that spiritual dimension was whatever we're doing needs to be part of our worship that is pleasing to the Lord. And so what we see at a very practical level, and I'm not sure I've got time to go into all of it, but under the Mosaic law, there was a whole lot of principles, rules, regulations for dealing with poverty, but more specifically dealing with members of the community who were experiencing a crisis. And basically, there was acknowledgement that there were times where people in need would have to borrow money. And there were a variety of ways that that used to take place, where to alleviate the problem, they would, for example, sell the crop value of their land, which to somebody who could afford that, to give them financial assistance. But then in the next Jubilee year, that land would come back to the previous owner. Where was the benefit? Well, the benefit to the person was they got access to land and could create crops and what have you. But land transferred back to every 7 years. I think it was Jubilee years, 7 years. Or was it 50? Yep, okay. Another very interesting thing under Mosaic law was there was provision and allowance for giving loans to people. And there was an expectation for loans to be repaid, but they were not allowed to charge interest on those loans. And nor were they actually allowed to sell food to those in need at profit. You saw in this passage that some people had even gone to the extreme of selling their kids and what have you into slavery. If things were really, really, really bad and under extreme need and poverty, people as a last resort could actually sell themselves into serving a master in the community for a period of 6 years. So not quite a slave, but certainly a servant who then would be supported in that household, fed and what have you. And at the end of 6 years, it was required that the master of that servant would release them. And as part of that release, give them food and supplies and animals and what have you to get back up on their feet. And so we see that in Deuteronomy 15. And there was provision for that person, rather than leaving after 6 years, to stay on in a voluntary capacity. Deuteronomy 15 again, all debts were cancelled every 7 years. So, without going too much further into this, the principles were that at a pragmatic level, the people of God were allowed to loan each other resource, money, but the principle was, do not use people in need as an opportunity to increase one's wealth. And so, this is the thing that we then come back to in this passage. Remember, I said Nehemiah makes a statement there, we did not buy any land. That's what was going on. Opportunity was there. People would buy it and exploit those in desperate need. But Nehemiah and his group, his team, didn't do that as long as they were there as governors. He was compassionate. Not only that, but even within the context of his official role under the Persian Empire and regime, he chose not to make claim on what was due to him in the way of taxes, salary, and what have you. Yet somehow in all of that, we see he continued to live out that governorship by providing daily people with foods. And it says there, in abundance. And so we see in Nehemiah a real contrast to where people in the community had arrived, and that was this moral integrity that he had, first and foremost, obeying and living out his life in his devotion and worship to God, as opposed to the way the Persian state did things and how society acted and behaved. Another thing that's kind of interesting here is Nehemiah's response to the situation. Having dealt with external opposition, that's one thing, but suddenly when you've got division and opposition taking place internally, that's a real test of one's leadership and character. And so what we see in his response is he gets angry, but he doesn't act out. He actually thinks about the situation and ponders the solution and I guess seeks God. And so what he does is he starts to his first response is really to separate the people from the problem. You see that in 5.8. This is a really interesting pattern for leadership. And he sees the conflict and the issue as a community problem, not us and them. Okay? The next thing that he does is he shows the wealthy leaders in the community, how their actions are actually hurting the whole community. In other words, in dealing with this and coming up with the solution, he positions that all within the context of the whole community, not just specific individuals in the community. And so out of that, the solutions that he comes up with are really geared to benefit everybody, not just a portion of it, of the community. And the real interesting part of this is what he does is he bases the solution back on God's law, God's principles, as I've just described, and under the Mosaic covenant. And it's interesting how, it says the nobles and the other officials couldn't disagree with him. And I suspect, going back to my earlier comment, that this was because they weren't necessarily willingly exploiting and sinning in that sense. They probably had no idea this is how God wanted them to operate. And so they were open to what Nehemiah was asking of them. And so what we see in his leadership style is he's really expedient, courageous. He doesn't back away from the problem. He tackles it head on, and he does it quite quickly. And as I mentioned, he was quite smart in that not only did he take their word that they'd would do this, but he got them to actually make an oath in front of the priests and the officials. I think to sort of bring this to a conclusion, and going back to some of the things I mentioned about to take note of in the beginning about who Nehemiah was, it's really interesting to me that he was a senior official working for the occupier, the state. Yet he was a man of God, able to, within the context of his job, his role in society, still live a godly life according to the principles, laws of God. He was still able to be generous, compassionate. We, as I said, see he doesn't take advantage of the situation like all his fellow officials were. And I think what's also interesting is, as I mentioned, his name, Nehemiah's name, was Yahweh has comforted, or the comfort of the Lord. Clearly that was part of his identity as a person in the way he operated. And I think this actually tells us, in conclusion, that God's heart is firmly centered in community. Community is as important to him as us as individuals. And I think as we reflect on this, I think, as I said, are there things that we're doing that we just take for granted that actually are hurting our community? And we see this taking place within the broader picture of that chronology that I put up earlier, of how God was rebuilding the temple, a place for worship, the walls, re-establishing and constituting this community that would come together in worship. Clearly, God wants us to be a community focused on what is beneficial and good for all of us as a whole, not just individuals. I don't know how we want to finish this, but I think we've got some worship. So I just had this real thing all week about community. What does that mean to us? And I think as we go into this time of worship and reflect on this passage and this transition point, I think if anybody's in need, now's the time for prayer. Bridget's here, some of the elders are around, but come forward if you're in need and need prayer as we worship. Thanks.